Welcome to 3 in the News. 3 in the News. A podcast for educators by educators. Brought to you by the Los Angeles Institute for Restorative Practices and Research, the authority on restorative practices in K through 12 education.
Hey everybody, welcome to 3 in the News by LARP. The structure of the podcast is simple. During every episode, we analyze and discuss 3 dominant news stories appearing in K through 12 news. Everything from teacher pay, cell phones, bullying, school policy, school politics, discipline, attendance, and much, much more. Let me introduce today my co-host and the CEO and founder of LARP, Carlos Alvarez. How are you doing today, my friend? Today's Saturday. So how are you doing?
We are working on a Saturday, beautiful Saturday morning. Good morning, good afternoon, whoever is hearing us in the Europe side. I'm excited to be here. We have some really cool topics to go into.
And just to put you on that, why were you late today? We were supposed to start.
Technical difficulties, y'all.
All right. And of course, we have our co-host, our third co-host or our second co-host, depending how I introduce her, Candice Dagnino. Candice, how are you doing today?
I'm great. I'm on time. I'm here.
You are on time. I appreciate you for that.
I am the first co-host here on time, just ready to roll. Excited to be in conversation with you all this morning.
I'm going to apply our attendance and tardy protocols on.
Please.
Yeah, we should. We should have some kind of attendance policy here, But you're right. Depending on who shows up first, that's the person I'll call my co-host, and then I'll call the third person just another person. All right. So, thank you so much for joining us today. We have 3 stories today. The first story comes from the Times of India, and it comes to focus in on California. In 2021, California made ethnic studies mandatory in public high schools, aiming to highlight the voices of marginalized communities. But just a few years later, the initiative has become a flashpoint, sparking lawsuits, political backlash, and fierce debate over whether it's education or indoctrination. The fight over ethnic studies reveals just how divided America remains on questions of identity, history, and democracy. Where one school district sees empowerment, another sees indoctrination. Where one community demands exposure to hard histories, another demands opt-outs, bans, and litigation. The debate over ethnic studies in California continues. So, this article talks a lot about the precedent that this is something that, has happened in the past. And I want to put this out there. I am a history teacher. I do teach the history standards. I've been teaching history for many years. And one of the, when I was in college, my college professor at Cal State Long Beach, she wrote a book titled The Fight for the Curriculum. And it focused in on the national debate that happened during the 1990s. And this is going to sound familiar, where they began to try to create national standards for the United States, national history standards, because the history that a student learns, for example, in Alabama, can't be different than the history a student is learning in Massachusetts. So in 1990, they set out to establish this national history standards. And just like this kind of history has the tendency to repeat itself, there was tons of debate and controversy over it. People like Lynn Cheney, Rush Limbaugh started saying that the national history standards were promoting left-wing revisionist ideology. Sound familiar? And so it culminated that in 1995, the U.S. Senate rejected the national standards and actually let every state kind of do it themselves. Now, I bring that up. Why? Because, look, this isn't a new debate. Ethnic studies is just the shiny new object now. But, it has happened for many years. And so, Candice, talk a little bit about why do you think this is happening? How does this, ethnic studies curriculum fall into the broader issues happening politically and socially?
Yeah, I think that this is obviously a hot topic now, but it's not necessarily been a one of its kind. I think that we've seen this time after time about whose stories are told, whose are not, how they are told. Recently, I think I heard a saying, oh gosh, I'm going to probably mess this up, but it's if you ask the story of how gosh, I'm gonna mess this up. It's like the
I think I know where you're going.
yeah.
Does this have to do with the lion?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, you heard it
If
too.
you
Right?
ask the lion to tell the story, the hunter is not a hero. Like kind of like it switches it there.
Yeah, but also if you ask the history of the lion, the hunters asked, right? Like I think we're both messing it up, which I can appreciate. I love that for us. But I'm really making light of, I think, a very critical experience that our young people are having. I think it is so important to understand, first and foremost, that like learning one's own heritage, culture, histories, it strengthens our identity safety. It really reduces this chronic threat that is signaling in the brain when students feel unseen or erased, for that matter. Stress really it impacts kids in very different ways. Their stress systems tone up. There's so much literature on social identity threat, stereotype threat. And I think conversely, if ethnic studies curricula are perceived as one-sided or biased, they can trigger identity threat for students who feel misrepresented or undermining their psychological safety is obviously having an impact. And so this is going to be, I think, a point of contention for people as long as we exist, because differences, I think, often are what create divides if we look at them that way. But I think we really need to start seeing, what could come of this if we were to do it effectively, if we were to really embrace our differences and accept it as this constant. So there's so much I can say on this. I want to give Alvarez an opportunity to speak on it too, but I struggle because I do have a very much a personal bias around this. And so I'd love to hear, Alvarez, what you have to say.
I feel like what we're seeing is that America no longer shares a common educational story, like education story. We're starting to see how we're being ripped apart, how everything's becoming so polarized. And some people might see it as empowerment and others see it as indoctrination. At the end of the day, we are taking that experience away from a student from building their own conclusions, their own insights around history. I remember being a first grader, second grader, and learning about like history, Christopher Columbus. We even used to sing the song to memorize the boats and stuff like that. And until later, when I started going into different classes at like middle school and high school, I started learning a little bit more on history. And I think that really helped me as a human being to really understand the complexities of everything. And I think what's happening now is we're this whole factor of control and controlling the narrative of what to expose our younger population, which they become our younger constituents. They're the younger generations. They're the ones they're going to push this thing forward. So I'm starting to see a lot of, for me, it's like more of a warning sign. Even progressive states cannot protect inclusive education from polarization. You turn on the news, you turn on social media, and what's happening is when we start siding to one side, we start allowing the other side, good or bad, to highlight their own stories. And then that's where we start really building confusion, really start building ambiguity.
And Candace and Carlos, I think this goes to a deeper question. I mean, I think ethnic studies, you look at the iceberg, and ethnic studies is like that little top of the iceberg, but there's so much below it. Because, I think this is a deeper question of what is America? Is America a nation of immigrants? Are we, what's the analogy? It's like a salad bowl or a melting pot. Like, if we are a salad bowl or a melting pot, which a melting pot is the idea that like you come and you just assimilate into the larger American story. The salad bowl idea is, you keep parts of yourself in the larger American context. And, unless we answer that question, these questions won't be answered themselves, because we can't really say, yes, there is a value in teaching Chicano studies, or there is a value in teaching African history, if we're thinking that there is, like you said, a single narrative of American history. And so it goes deeper than ethnic studies. I think it goes to, what is America? Are we a nation of immigrants? And if we are, what does that mean? And how do we teach that?
Yeah, and I think too, we have to consider that in these conversations, we have to be open to restorative framing. I think that there's a real fear in highlighting all of the faults of Americans as they created this country and all of the harm that was caused in establishing this country. And I think that that's the real difficult, I think, mirror to face, that in highlighting the histories of other people, like we have often, I think, grown up as Americans glorifying, and I think going back to our analogy, the story of the hunter, right? And so until the lion has its own historian, we're always going to see the hunt as this glorified experience. And we need to be willing and ready to start to unpack a lot of the brutalities, a lot of the harms that were caused, because in naming the harm, and we know this as restorative practitioners, we're inviting voice, we're co-constructing the story, the curricula in this case. And I think it's important that we need to emphasize voice, equity, and repair. And the repair means first we highlight the harm. And I think a lot of people are having a hard time with really naming there was some real harm happening here. And I think that there's still hope in recognizing that once we can do that, then we do better. We start to move in ways that are, not as harmful. We start to identify and I think ask for the grace and the patience that is in the healing process moving forward. But people, I think, have a real hard time with naming first and foremost that there were some harms here.
And I will say this, I know we can speak critically of the U.S., but the U.S. in a lot of ways is one of the only countries grappling with this, because there are other countries like Brazil, Colombia, other European countries that they don't make an effort to include different stories in their history, and so the United States, for as much as this is an issue, is grappling with this. They're struggling with what is America? How do we tell the story of everybody in America? Because if you go to Brazil, you have Afro-Brazilians, their story is not being told. You have indigenous Brazilians, their stories are not being told. And there's not even this debate, So I think the United States, with all its faults, is trying.
One thing that I travel a lot, and when I come back, at least when I leave out the country and I come back to the States, I'm this sense of I'm proud to be American. Even at its situation where it's at right now, I'll go to different places are like, oh, you're American, and they start saying all the negative stuff that's happening, and I don't see it. I see it as there's a lot of bad stuff. In the United States, we're doing a lot of great stuff, but we're doing a lot of stuff that's very confusing and building a lot of separate ideology. But what we're thinking about at the end of the day is we're taking away from our kids, we're doing limited critical thinking. We're not allowing them to really think about the global aspects, the cultural disconnections, the increased divisions. And we're also reducing empathy when we're evaporating these stories, and we're not allowing our students, our younger populations, to really understand what has happened. We're taking away from identity. And I think that's not our job as educators, is to educate.
Yeah.
I've worked with a lot of educators that could influence, that have used their platform as an educator to influence in negative ways, and I think those are the parts that we need to be checking as administrators. How do we start really moving this ahead in a way where, because I could give you this example, right? You go into a history class, and you might, and I'm thinking about one history class in particular that I used to visit a lot. It was very, very dynamic. There was a lot of engagement. And in that class, if you would go and you would just position a question, you would have so much input. And that only happened because you had very robust ways of learning there. And that allowed so much beautifulness to happen, so much embraceness. So I think what we're doing now is we're moving now to a restricted mind. And when that starts happening, we start closing up. And I think also one of the biggest things, everyone trying to say their own story wants to come out the victorious one in this story, but also avoids the small little deficits that, I probably did harm. And those things are not attractive to say. So we try to evaporate those things. So I think allowing to share our stories the way they come.
Yeah. And Carlos, I think you hit something, right on the nail on the head there. And it's about, teachers, by trying to standardize this is by kind of taking away the teacher's ability to infuse or indoctrinate. There's a lot of fear of indoctrination that I'm putting my kids in front of this person. This person has their own personal biases, and they're going to infuse my child with those biases. I mean, I know like right now the Israeli Palestinian conflict is a huge thing, and there's teachers with really, really strong opinions on this. And, parents are a little afraid, like, what are they going to tell my child in regards to this? And their fear comes out towards more standardization. Like, take away, like, make sure everything's standardized so like this person can infuse it. But we're humans at the end. And Candace, I'll give you the last word. I know I kind of just went off on a tangent, but like, how do you as an administrator, that fear of indoctrination, that the teacher kind of infuses everything with their own opinion, what's your experience in that? How would you mitigate that as an administrator?
I think we're human beings first and foremost, right? And so that is absolutely going to happen because we all come with our own biases, our own conditioned beliefs and experiences. And as a leader of a school, it's my responsibility to keep that at the forefront, but also to do the work, the very hard work of exploring and unpacking what racisms are coming into the classrooms and what biases are coming into the classrooms. And a lot of educators, one, won't admit that that's the case, but we all come with them. And racism manifests in the classroom when we don't unpack it, when we don't do the work to understand where our beliefs are coming from, where our values are situated, and how those will inevitably come into our space of learning. And I think that we talk about indoctrination quite a bit, especially when we start thinking about ethnic studies, but we also don't consider how we indoctrinate our kids in so many other ways. Right now we have lots of talk about the church and the state and, are we indoctrinating in one way over the other? I think at the end of the day, ethnic studies isn't just about content. It's really about intervention on identity safety. If done well, I think it can quiet a lot of the threat circuits in the brain. If done without the relational process, it can evoke identity threat, especially for students who are feeling marginalized. And so ultimately it comes down to, do we have safety in psychological safety? Do we have safety amongst our staff that we can have these conversations and really unpack what is happening? And so I tell my teachers all the time, our job is to put the facts out there. And as much as I say this, as much as it is about giving our kids critical thinking skills so that they can make these decisions for themselves, we're also flawed human beings who will inevitably bring out our own opinions and thoughts into this. And so it's about constantly working with the adult to understand how those are surfacing and how those potentially could be harmful to kids if not really unpacked and addressed. Yeah.
And, before we move on to the second article, this is being compared to, it's an unfunded mandate. Like the California did pass the ethnic studies class, but many districts don't have the money to do it. I will say this, Candace, and this is from personal experience. I know that your district is working hard to fund this mandate, finding the money to do this. One of the organizations hired by your district is Thinking Nation, which promotes critical thinking, promotes kind of like the historical thinking skills. To put it above this kind of like this divisiveness and put it more on the thinking skills. But they funded it. They hired this organization, nonprofit organization, to create the curriculum. And that says a lot about your district. They're not just going, oh, we don't have the money, like it's an unfunded mandate. Like, no, we're going to do it because we see a value in it.
Yep. And now Thinking Nation better drop us some change for that call out. Just saying.
Yeah, I'll make sure I tell them. So, all right. Our second story comes from NPR, National Public Radio, which I know is also under attack and being defunded. The NPR article discusses how the Trump administration is tightening control over federal education funding, using it as leverage to enforce ideological compliance in schools. The administration has withheld or delayed billions in grants intended for K-12 programs, such as English learner services, teacher training, and after-school programs, and attached new conditions that restrict the use of funds things like DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. It also outlines the risks that pose to locally run school districts, which may struggle to maintain services or shift budgets in response. This article underscores how budgetary decisions are becoming a tool in the larger fight over curriculum and educational policies. And Candice, I'll put it there, for you. Like, what have you seen on the ground of like how these federal funding decisions are impacting your district?
Yeah, well, I mean, right off the bat, we were struck with threats about losing our aftercare program, our before school programming that provides so much opportunity for kids who often don't have access to extracurriculars outside of school, safety or places of safety outside of school. And that was tough. Having conversations at the end of last school year about, all these extras that we were able to take advantage of, especially with ESSER fundings or all of the funds that came following the COVID pandemic. And so, a lot of us had really fluffed up our staffing roster so we could provide supports for what we would quote unquote call like learning loss and all the things and all of the alerts that came up after COVID. And it actually just was a universal support. We had lots of people who could provide, learning opportunities and care for kids in ways that we knew they needed following the pandemic. And then we were told, well, those things got to go.
Yeah.
Being strategic about who could we actually cut without losing programming or the integrity of the programming.
Yeah. And Carlos, I know, look, in our work in restorative practices, there's been an impact there. What have you seen, Carlos, in this industry and the kind of decisions districts are having to make?
I'm positioned in a very unique situation. I'm in the conversations with a lot of superintendents, a lot of like bureau chiefs around funding and where are we going to move funding across. And what I'm starting to see is everyone had this like halt of like, I don't know where funding is coming from. I don't know if we're going to keep this. So like, let's freeze all professional development, and maybe all my educational companies could kind of relate with this. Like that June, July, August, September months have been pretty slow because people are in this state of fear. And you're like, okay, well, what am I going to do now? Well, it looks like we're going to go ahead and provide professional development. But we're in like week 1 of October, and we are already seeing the ramifications of not having accurate development for teachers around social emotional learning. We're starting to see more schools with aggression, more students with dysregulation. And we think about COVID, right? I feel that we were successful in some ways with our students during COVID because there was a lot of funding. The funding was very much focused on social emotional learning, connection, belonging. And that really helped us get back into a state of normalcy. It didn't happen overnight, but it did happen pretty quick. A lot of our students' concerns that we were seeing were a lot rooted in anxiety and like the adjustment situations. We didn't see anything around, that they were moving the school aside, that they didn't want to come to school. So what I'm starting to see now is we're starting to become very hyper focused on, okay, what are we going to do and what are we investing in? And we're also seeing the deficits because of that. And this is impacting very high poverty districts. You're hearing about like possibly losing 3 times of funding. And when you think about high poverty funding, I grew up in the city of Maywood, which it was high poverty, and we didn't have everything. We only had 6 computers, like brand new Mac computers that had colors, and we had a school of 300 had to share them. We had to we were timed through there's a lot of things that our communities are gonna experience within the next couple of weeks, within the next couple of months. And I'm thinking, hopefully, we start really seeing at the center of this is we're taking away from our children's development more than anything. It's easy to fight back and forth with this, here's that. But at the end of the day, who's getting caught up in the middle of all this is that vulnerable student.
Yeah. And Carlos, the article does talk about that federal funding makes up about 11% of a school district, which it's not 50%, it's not this astronomical number, but it's significant because 11%, that is after school programming, that is tutoring service, that's having IAs in the classroom, and those are the things that are impacted when these cuts are made. Now, my biggest concern here is the weaponization of budgets. Kind of, I know that the Trump administration right now is using budgets as a weapon, and you can say, well, that's what they get, but the pendulum of power will swing back, and I don't think it's right for any Democratic president now to go into a red state and begin withholding funding there. Kind of like it's your turn now, because again, like you just said, the kids are in the middle. I don't care if they're a blue state, red state, they're kids, and the kids are caught up in the middle of this political game, which is sick. And the funding issues right now are predominantly impacting disadvantaged kids. I mean, they're cutting English language learner program. Look, I was an English language learner. I remember being pulled out of the classroom one time a day and having extra support on my English development, and I needed it. And there's kids that need it. I work with kids that need it. And so this idea that like you can take away these resources or weaponize the budgets and gain, like those are kids. Those are kids, and it's sad.
I agree. And I think that, you both have said it, but cuts are not neutral. They're falling hardest on the most vulnerable. I think that this in turn affects teachers because they're carrying the stress load. When they are burning out, it's often tied to policy level instability. I think that when we underfund schools, we're not just shortchanging, supplies. We're really eroding our teachers' capacity for a compassionate presence because they're having to think through all of the other ways that they need to be creative about what they have to do, speaking to these mandates without the resources, right? Teachers often face that. There are lots of things teachers have to do, and often without the resources, the supplies, or the support to be able to do it effectively. And I think that when we consider these budget cuts, be it for political moves and leverage, ultimately, you've mentioned being a student who came in as an EL, as an English language learner. We have students with diverse needs. And while that wasn't my personal experience, I think we need to understand that as educators, our commitment is also to really empathizing with the people who may not have been like us, who may not be growing up in similar experiences. And while I didn't necessarily have, the journey through English language learning or the journey through having supports as a student with a disability, I still recognize how incredibly important it is for all kids to get the support and the resources that they need. And I just don't understand why those same beliefs and desires aren't at the forefront of our policymakers' work. And that's just really heartbreaking, because could you imagine if budgets, it's not even imagine. Let's be real. Yeah. Our budgets are our moral documents. They show us what we believe in. They show us what we care about. If you say, show me the money, I'm going to tell you who you care about and who you believe is worthy of thriving. And as a restorative leader, I think you need to ask who will be harmed with these cuts and how do we repair it? But we don't necessarily have that level of restoration at our policy decision-making levels.
Yeah. And I mean, Carlos, you and I worked at a school where every kid had free lunch, and there was no that's like, it's sick to think that somebody could be like, oh, they're misusing that. I mean, for a lot of kids, they were looking forward to that first meal a day.
I've came into so much, like I reflect a lot, and sometimes even reflecting on these situations brings so much sadness to you, because you're straight thinking, like, I know me, you, Will, and Candace, we have seen actual, like, we live with students, and you're actually seeing their experience. We would have a couple of students. I have one student in mind that just jumps into mind, that he would memorize the lunch schedule. He would know exactly what was being served, and he would always ask for seconds because he wanted to take it back home. He wanted to share it with his dad. And when you start hearing those stories, you're not like, oh, he's just being cute. It's like, wow, this family really has need. And like, I would pull the kid away and I'm like, hey man, you really like our food? Give us some feedback. I wanna like improve our meals. And he's like, oh, Mr. Alvarez, your your lunch here is great. I just wish I could get more. And he was very vulnerable in saying, if I don't eat here, me and my little brothers don't eat. So it's just hearing that. And I feel like people get so disconnected and these are people that are not on the ground seeing this, because I could guarantee you, if you spend one day, 1 week in these communities, in these schools, your mind is going to change really quick. It's so easy to get up there and start kind of dehumanizing, right? Like kind of desensitizing yourself from the issue. But that's where it's at. It's bad. It's horrible. It's evil. It's not moving anything ahead. It's just taking away from vulnerable populations, and specifically vulnerable children.
Yeah, and before we go to the next story, there's Ta-Nehisi Coates. I hope I said his name right. He has a saying where you don't understand the problems by looking at them at the aggregate level. Like you see $2 billion in cut, like that's an abstraction. What you need to do is think about that one kid who is eating for the first time at school, who's trying to see if there's a second meal that he can take home. And then you understand the issue. Like, you don't understand issues at the aggregate level. And so you always narrow it down to the person. Like, if you can tell one story, 500,000 people dead, like, oh my God, what does that mean? But let me tell you about the story about how this one person died. And we tend to relate more to those kind of stories, and they break down these macro level problems into small chunks that I can get. And so I think, as the Trump administration is proposing these cuts, I think we're losing sight of those small, like the impact of that one person. And these are numbers for people. These are numbers on a piece of paper, but these are real live kids that we work with every day that are going to be impacted by this decision. So Candace, I'll give you the last word before we move to the next story.
Yeah, I just say that, when we slash budgets for our most vulnerable students, because ultimately those are who feel the greatest impact, we're not just cutting line items, we're cutting away the very buffers that shield those young brains from toxic stress. And that is a real harm that will have ripple effects for years to come. And I don't think that we are putting emphasis or enough emphasis on that, especially, and it's even more, I think, cruel, as you said, Alvarez. I think it's cruel if you think about policy changes that are knowing this full well and still doing it anyway.
And thank you, Candace, for that. And let's move on.
Can I just like this surfaced? Well, Candace was highlighting this. It just goes back to like this moral responsibility, even to our listeners. I know we have like about a hot 100 plus have downloaded our podcast, which is growing, and we have a lot more people, but it's also pushing the narrative. Like, we're in this country where you hear like these topics where they're talking about like, hey, reduction of this, like, why should we pay for your free lunch after school? Why should we do this? And we're in this world. Also, the US we're developing this whole situation of separatism. Like, we're better, we're not that. And by you might not need this free lunch, mijo, you might not need that. We start building this separatism and we start detaching away from the issue. I want to challenge everyone, push in when you're hearing these situations. Don't just take it by like face value, like what you just said, Will. Like, it's very easy to put a very sexy headline like, we're not going to provide food for people that don't want to work or whatever. It's not about that. Push the narrative.
Yeah. Well, our third story is a little bit different. The article argues that public education is lacking positive stories. And I would say that we are guilty of this. We tend to navigate towards the negative. The article argues that we need positive stories and innovative stories that deserve more attention in education. It highlights how the League of Innovative Schools helps districts share creative ideas, how the Grable Foundation has worked to provide grants on providing positive stories in education. The authors urge educators to shift the focus from problems to successes, showing that public schools are places of creativity and hope. And the article talks a little bit about this concept in psychology called negativity bias, which occurs when we focus more on the adverse events than the positive events. So why do you think, Carlos, that we're so drawn to negativity in education and focus so much on the problems instead of the amazing work we know is happening everywhere?
when we think about, it spikes up so much, the interest, the amygdala, the like, hey, what's happening? So it starts creating these feelings in your body. And of course, it's going to be a little bit more attractive to hear who's the bad person and who's the good person when you're hearing what's wrong with education or what's happening well. We always want to position ourselves in that situation. But yes, absolutely. We have experienced so much when we like, even now, like these past conversations have been, I want to say, like slightly negative, like the negative pieces, but like all the amazing things that are happening in schools, I feel that don't get highlighted because a lot of these situations boggle everything down. And, like even having these conversations about culture celebrations in schools and, like how are students engaging in more empathic actions with other students. Those stories are not as attractive as, hey, let's remove $2 billion from the budget.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm sorry. We're living I feel like we're living like in a soap opera, man. Like it's the episode that has the most controversy is going to have the most views. And, like sometimes rainbows and butterflies and puppies don't create that much views. And I feel like we're in this situation right now where we're hypersensitive again, where we're living in this world where our amygdala is hyperjacked. So we're consistently craving that information because that offers some sort of security or safety.
Yeah. And, I will say, Candace, if I turn it to you, my wife actually does not watch the news, and she's an intelligent person, went to college and, has her master's degree, but she has no idea what's happening in the world. And one time, I asked her, I was like, what, why do you do that? Why do you stay misinformed? And she said, because it impacts me so much. Like it impacts my ability to wake up with a smile, to, to put on a positive face, to face the things that I need to. And I think a lot about that because, like the news can bring you down. I mean, I see news stories, I read some things that impact me all day. Candace, what do you think about, the negative spin on education right now and the way negative stories dominate the news?
I mean, I agree. News cycles thrive on conflict and crisis, but I also have to consider that there's like a real neural aspect to this too. Like the human brain has a built-in negativity bias because we're wired to notice threats more than opportunities. Just evolutionarily, like we have to notice these dangers to keep us alive, right? I think that's the psychological aspect. I also think, though, we have to consider just the narratives that shape the like neural possibility. I agree that we should absolutely be more thoughtful as educators, especially leaders in education. But like what we believe shapes what we attempt, right? This idea like Carol Dweck brought up around having a growth mindset. If all students here are deficit stories or, all of the limits, they start to internalize them. I think positive stories do expand just a mental map of what's possible. And we have to do this strategically because while I can understand your wife's perspective, I also have had to take breaks from a lot of the media. We also have a real responsibility to see it, to hear it, to watch it, right? And so I don't necessarily put so much blame on all that is real because that is the reality that we are living in. And much like banning ethnic studies or being, really critical about what we're teaching, we're also then saying, are we going to limit the reality that we are living through? Because that is really undermining the experience that our kids, our young people are having in this day. Yeah.
And I mean, as a principal, Candace, you might not be able to control the larger narrative happening in the news story or in the news cycle on X or Twitter or whatever you want to call it. But how do you control positivity in your school campus? Like, what sort of things do you do or have you done to ensure that there is positivity? Those positive stories happening at your school are the most salient stories being told.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky balance because on one end, you could very well sink into all that is negative and all you're doing is highlighting. I mean, I was just talking about this as we did a data dive, right? As simple as data analysis and like quickly running to like, where are all the gaps? What do we got to fix? Rather than sitting with the celebration of where are we really thriving? What are we doing well? And I know personally that is a challenge of mine. I'm constantly trying to figure out how do we get better? How do we, bridge these gaps? But I do think that hope is a developmental nutrient. We need to see it as a protective factor. It's as powerful as the relationships. And I think that positive storytelling, positivity is not necessarily always staying in the land of nice. It's about highlighting hope, highlighting a space where our kids and the adults leading this work have something to hold on to. Because yes, damn, this work can be trying and heavy and sometimes just debilitating. It's hard sometimes to keep moving forward, but you have to.
Yeah. And Carlos, I was thinking about your wife, Adriana, when because the article talks about Mr. Rogers, and tell that story. She ends her presentation in a unique way with that video of Mr. Rogers. Like, I think it encapsulates like the need to lift people up.
Yeah, I stay focused on news, world news, but Adriana is a machine when it comes to like information. Something happened a minute ago and she'll know like a minute 0.5 later. And it's amazing, but I've seen how that impacts her also. Yeah. Like she's sometimes like in this situation, like I'm a little upset, I'm moody. I'm like, well, what's going on? It's just everything that's happening. So and this is something that's very unique to her part, and I started really copying it also, and we have a couple of presenters that do the same, is after presenting all this that's happening with, student behavior, and we'll go into regulation, and we go into really servicing students, and it elicits a lot of just baggage, a lot that, educators have to do. And we end it with Dr. Rogers goes up into his, like, he's being recognized. And there's like this, he asked for this like 1 minute, just quiet remembrance of the people that you love and that love you.
Yeah.
And that right there makes so many educators just cry.
Yeah.
And it's not that she's doing anything. It's just like, hey, just think about the people that love you, and think about the people you love, and think about why you're here is because of that. And it just, it hits that spot. And I think having those micro dosages of good experiences are severely important, because those little moments they stay caught up in your signature, in your autonomic nervous system, and they motivate you to push through. So critically important, man. But I feel one of the biggest things too is like, we don't have a lot of happy stories happening right now, so we can't just fabricate stories. We're hearing so many, our communities are being torn apart. We're hearing families. Just a couple of weeks ago, I just heard one of our really involved parents, when I was a high school administrator, he just got picked up by ICE going on and this man thrived in doing everything correct. Yeah. He went to court, and I'm like, you're going to get taken in court, right? And he's like, yeah, but that's the thing that I have to do.
Yeah.
And when you think about that, what positive story could come out of that? You see this young family now like in chaos, and like it's really easy to get caught up in the muck, Will. It's really easy to get caught up and really like, where you kind of feel like, am I being weird by like coming in here and being all cheerful and happy when, half of my community right now is being torn apart, is in fear, is scared. So I think it's also like you feel that.
I think you said it, Carlos. It's not necessarily, becoming toxic positive or toxic positivity. It's those you just said it, those micro doses of positivity that we need. I'm not trying to change the narrative. Like, there's a lot of crappy stuff out there happening. I'm turning on the news as well, but we can still have those small micro doses of happiness. I can still tell Candace, like, hey, I'm really grateful for you. I'm grateful for all the work that you do. Like, that's not a lie. Carlos, I can say I appreciate you. Like, that's not a lie. I'm not trying to fabricate a story or manufacture a positive story. I'm showing gratitude. And I think, we need to really be purposeful in that, because then our tendency is negativity, chaos, everything's wrong. And then that's the context, that's the water that we're swimming in to teach our kids. And so, we have to acknowledge that it's polluted, it's dark, but we also have to do our work to make it better. So,
Will,
all right.
Will, can I just add really quick? I know I keep on adding to
No,
our,
Carlos, you're done today. I'm cutting you off today, man.
and my 10 minutes, I came in late. I'm sorry, you know.
No, go ahead,
But
man. Well, I'm gonna give you the final word, and then Candace, I'm gonna bring it back to you for our final positive thought of the week. Carlos, go ahead.
I'm sorry, y'all, but I'm getting ready for a couple of pretty big keynotes, and I was just doing a lot of reflecting, a lot of reading, and one piece of information surfaced, and the theorist is kind of leaving my mind. I don't want to misquote him, but I could add it based on our debrief here. He said that, us as human beings, like, have we evolved? And evolution is like, when you start thinking about evolution, we start thinking about, like, has things gotten better as human beings? And human beings, innate, they're going to create, they're going to destroy, they're going to conquer, they're going to separate, build separation. So when we start thinking about, like, wow, like, and this theorist positioned the question saying, we must be naive to think that a lion is going to stop killing and hunting. As human beings, we are not going to stop conquering and hating and building oppression. But what you could do is starts with yourself. Like, there's this amazing person by the name of Ken Wilber, and they asked him a question, is like, how do we change this world, and why should we even care? And he's like, well, do you want to change the world? You start meditating and you start working on yourself. So I think that's what this is like. The vector of success is, how can you position yourself to be sane, to be an influence, a beacon of hope for others, where they see you, they see light, and they see hope.
Yeah, and we've been talking a lot about lions here, and probably misquoting them in this story. About we got to get it. We got to get it right. But Carlos, thank you for that. And Candace, as we're talking about positivity, leave us for the thought of the week, as people are probably listening during at the beginning of the week or towards the end. Give us that thought.
Well, I think across all three stories that we've covered, contested curriculum, shrinking budgets, and the desperate need for hopeful narratives, I think the through line is compassion. The brain cannot learn under chronic threat. Our students cannot thrive when their identities are erased and when their supports are stripped, or when they are told only deficit stories. The call to us as educators and leaders is really about building safety, building hope, and a sense of belonging. That is the work of repair. I think that's the work of care, and that is the work that changes lives.
Candace, I love the cadence that you follow when you speak. I feel like I like, how do I follow that up? All right, but
you're so motivated.
Let me have the last word. Let's go. Yeah.
Can it be Monday already so I could go to work? Wow, I feel motivated, y'all.
No, well, first of all, thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Candace, for joining me on this Saturday morning to record this podcast. So, if you're listening, you can listen to us on the 3 in the News on Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and Amazon Music. Be sure to follow us to get notifications on new episodes. Thank you for listening, and I appreciate you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.